There we go. All right, that's to share with all the people who aren't here today. Acts chapter 14, Paul and Barnabas are continuing the journey that they started last week in 13. You remember they made it as far as Paphos, and then from Paphos, they made it onto the main shoreland. They've lost John Mark along the way. He's gone home to his mama. Apparently it was more than he could deal with at this point. He'll be back. Paul will even ask for him at a later time. But they're going to make their way to 3 different cities today, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe, and that's what we're going to take a look at. It was a story from way back, 1945. Plane landed that was on fire, smoking. It was a wreck. As it landed, the pilot got off, dazed, not because of the condition of the plane, which was really bad shape. He gets dazed because of what had been done by Sergeant Irwin, who was his navigator. There were only 2 men in the B-29 at that point. There was the pilot flying and Sergeant Irwin in the back navigating. He had a long table out all the way across the center of the plane there. They were on a run not to bomb, they were dropping phosphorus markers. If you know anything about phosphorus, then you might know burns bright white, burns hot, almost impossible to put out. So it continues to burn long after it's been placed, and it'll burn through anything. Goes through other metals like butter. So what they were doing was flying over an area and dropping these white phosphorus bombs that would land and mark locations where other bombers behind them could see it clearly at night and wouldn't have to think twice about where to drop their bombs. So that's what they're doing, and then something went wrong. Somehow Sergeant Irwin would look at the map, and when they were over a place where they wanted to mark it, he'd reach over and take one of the phosphorus bombs and drop it down a big tube that ran down the center of the airplane and out the bottom. It would light itself on its way out of the tube and then drop to the ground where it would mark the location they were trying to go. Well, this one time, he dropped it into the tube like he always did, and for some reason, it went off before it got out of the tube. Now, it's not a bomb per se, but the phosphorus lit up and started burning. Sergeant Irwin lost his hearing in the initial explosion, but the worst part was it had blown most of the metal back up into the plane. So as he looked, got up off of the ground and saw that there was white phosphorus burning on the plane, he knew it would burn right through the metal of the airplane and out the bottom, which normally wouldn't be a bad thing. He could get rid of it that way, except carried underneath the airplane were all the bombs that they'd be dropping later. And that's where the phosphorus would go, and he knew he had to do something. He picked up the white hot phosphorus burning now inside the plane. He had gloves on, but they were gone in a flash. Started heading for the front of the plane because the only opening was the window by the pilot. Making his way to the front, he got to where the table was with all his maps on it that had been bolted in place, and he had to hold the phosphorus with one arm against his chest while he tried to get the table moved out of the way, and then continued forward. The only thing the pilot knew was when he stuck his head in the cabin and said, "Excuse me, sir," and heaved it out the window. He got the Medal of Valor while he was laying in his hospital bed. He lost his vision in one eye. His hearing was still gone. Hands, arms, rib cage area, one of his legs were burnt. Horrible. But the word valor is what I wanted to look at because it's not a word we use much anymore. Valor is one of those words that it seems like has disappeared with time. We don't like to apply it to people anymore who have valorous deeds. We've kind of gotten a little caustic, I think, in our day and age. We never really believe anything is valorous. We always think there must be some kind of motive behind it, something else going on. And so we don't use the term. And I don't think valor has to be used for like those one-time events like Sergeant Irwin and his bombs. I think you could use it for something else. How about a young woman in her 20s who has a handicapped child and now gives her entire life over Life is done except for the raising and nurturing and caring for this child. It seems kind of valorous to me, if I understand the word right. In Acts chapter 14, we run into a lot of valor as well. In Acts chapter 14, we find out why it is that Peter, James, John, Paul, and Jesus, all the writers of the New Testament, write about how, as believers, we will suffer. If we follow God, there'll be pain involved. And they understood it and believed it, and maybe that's what brought them to a place where they could go through what they did. But we start in verse 1 here where it says, at Iconium, they entered together into the Jewish synagogue and spoke in such a way that a great number of both Jews and Greeks believed. But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. And so they remained for a long time, speaking boldly for the Lord, who bore witness to the word of his grace, granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. So they're in Iconium, which is an old town. Iconium's an old town, and they're proud of it. They've been around longer than Damascus has, in fact. And they'll tell anybody who comes near they've been around long. They had a king. The first king of Iconium was named Nanakis, and there's a common phrase being used at this time when Paul and Barnabas go through when they say, since the time of Nanakis of Iconium. It's their version of in the beginning. Because as far as they were concerned, there wasn't anything that came before Nanakis of Iconium. So that's the kind of town that's going on. There are some Jews in town, and so there's a synagogue there, and that's where Paul starts preaching. And it says that he had a lot of success in the synagogue, but opposition started rising. Opposition started rising not only from the people in Iconium, it had followed them from the last place they'd been in. Remember, all along the way, this is the pattern. They preach the gospel. They tell people about the good news and the forgiveness that God is willing to offer. And some people receive it with joy, but some people are really ticked. And not only won't they receive this message, they're going to make sure it stops. They're like anti-evangelism. Anti-evangelists, maybe, or something. Anti-missionary. So they're following from the towns that they first heard the message to the next town, and when they don't catch up with Paul and Barnabas, they follow them to the next town. And in Iconium, some of them arrive, and they convince the people of Iconium that they need to stop. They need to get after them. They need to drive them out and even stone them, it says. It got so hot, they only stayed for 3 more months, apparently. Apparently this is not unusual to Paul. He's not surprised a bit. And when people stand up and say, we need you gone, he says, be on my way in a minute. Only got a couple more people to talk to. So they stay about 3 months. But look, Paul's a realist. I mean, he's an optimist too, but he's a realist. He knows after 3 months, they shake the dust off their feet and they make their way to the next town. The gospel, like light, will always, when they really hear it and understand it, cause pain, because that's what light does to darkness. Light, whether it's entering a dark city, a dark town, a dark village, or a dark heart and mind, causes pain because light and darkness can't mix. But light will also cause things to grow. In every place they went, if the gospel was preached, and in every place you go, if the gospel is heard, there'll be 2 reactions. There always will be. It will divide. Do not think I've come to bring peace, Jesus said, but a sword. It will divide the darkness from the light. And in you and me, the division happens as well. Can't be avoided. So Paul and Barnabas start this 80-mile quest on their way to Lystra, where they're going to get the same kind of treatment in the end. In 80 miles, they make their way over the top of the Dog Mountains, and in the top of the Dog Mountains, they get snow, because it's always snowy on top of the Dog Mountains, so I can tell you that. They make their way down the other side. Ever taken an 80-mile walk, by the way? They're going through a lot of trouble here to get to places to tell people the gospel, but they get to a place called Lystra. Derbe is going to be another 60 miles further. But they get to Lystra first, which, when you think of Lystra, think like Old West, frontier town. These are folks that don't have a lot of truck with people from the outside. These are people that are proud of who they are. They don't even speak the Greek language you see in the text. They've got their language. They've always spoken it. It's plenty good for us. They are, by and large, as a group of people, uneducated. They are, by and large, poor, but they are, by and large, proud of who they are and where they've come from. So that's the place that they get into when Paul and Barnabas arrive, and it says at Lystra, there was a man sitting who could not use his feet. And he was crippled from birth and had never walked. And he listened to Paul speaking, and Paul, looking intently at him and seeing that he had faith to be made well, said in a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." And he sprang up and began walking. Did a little buck dance in front of everybody. And the whole town is floored. Paul tries, it says, to go back to his sermon. They're not listening anymore. They're not paying any attention. Because they make the same mistake most people make. They assume the miracle itself is what they should be paying attention to. When in fact, in Acts as in other places, it's called a sign or a wonder because it's meant to point to the message. It's meant to point to the message and give it some validity. Paul and Barnabas continue to try and preach the good news, tell them about the gospel, tell them about forgiveness, but they can't help themselves. They're all starting to gather, and they're bringing the priests in from out of town, and they got a bull they're going to sacrifice, and garlands they're wearing. Well, see, there was this old story here in town and in the whole region about the time that Zeus and Hermes came to town. The Roman gods. They came into town, Zeus and Hermes, and they looked like poor travelers, and they were just looking for somebody to provide them with some hospitality. Would somebody just take us in? Would somebody just give us a place to stay? Would somebody just give us a little something to eat? Despite the fact that throughout the Mediterranean world at this time, it was just a thing you did. If somebody showed up in the square and there was nowhere to go, they're in hotels. Somebody should take them in. That's what we do, is hospitality. Not in this town. I told you, they don't have much truck with outsiders. We don't want them here. You can just keep walking. Well, apparently Zeus and Hermes, according to the story, found one older couple who was willing to bring them in, give them what little bit of food they had, what little bit of comfort they could provide, and in the morning, Zeus and Hermes turned their hovel, according to the story, turned their hovel into a mansion. Provided them everything they needed, and then turned and destroyed everything in the valley and all the people living there for not giving them hospitality. Well, the people in town all know this story very well. And suddenly they have two guys who showed up and just healed a guy miraculously that's had his feet twisted his whole life. They don't know for certain who this is, but they ain't taking any chances that it happens again. This has got to be Zeus and Hermes. I actually find it kind of humorous that they assume Barnabas is Zeus and Paul is Hermes, the spokesperson. Is it because Barnabas is more godlike and better looking? Is it just because Paul is kind of short and bald? Is that what's going on? I don't know why, but they decide Barnabas is Zeus, Paul is Hermes, and they're going to have a sacrifice. And let me ask you, would that have been so wrong? I mean, it's been a tough trip. It's been a long time. They've been on the road for months and months and months. They've been doing everything they can to preach the gospel, giving of themselves over and over, and by and large, the response has been bad. And people hating on them, people yelling at them, people driving them out of town. Would it have hurt so much to just let them have a little feast, a little celebration, a little party, a few gifts coming in, would have helped the budget some, certainly, for this trip. And then slowly, as we knew more about the language and the culture here, we could try to kind of explain the gospel to them after that. Would that have hurt anything? Yeah? Yeah, it would have. It happens all the time. The gospel shows up in a place, and people take it for what they want it to be. People use it for what they want it to do. Jesus, you'll remember when he came into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, "Hail to the King! Woohoo! Glad you're here." And then they find out, oh, he's not going to rescue us from the Romans right off. He's not going to provide us and make us king of the universe anymore. Kill him. Get rid of him. Because that's not what we want. We want what we want. In our day and age, I know in Bethlehem, they couldn't find any room at the inn. In our day, if we knew it was Jesus, we'd probably get him a penthouse. We'd probably treat him nice. Talk to anybody you know and mention how Jesus was a great teacher, and they probably agree with you. Mention how he was a good man, and they probably agree with you. Start talking about how his death is for their forgiveness, and put something on them in their life in the way of responsibility for turning to him in repentance. Well, now you got to fight. Because that's not what we want. That God isn't the God we were looking for. And so, by and large, our society has put Jesus into this little box, and we like him to stay right there where he's harmless. He doesn't do any damage. And that's exactly what would have happened if Paul and Barnabas would have done the same thing. But no, they didn't allow it. They ripped their clothes and said, "We're men just like you. What are you doing?" And then Paul has this message where he says, "You need to repent." "Men, why are you doing these things?" he said. "We're men just like nature that you are. We bring you good news. But you need to turn from the vain things you are following and serve the living God." You need to turn from the things that you believe, which are vanity, and you need to serve the one true God. Oh, that's not a message anybody likes. You're going to start preaching repentance. You're going to have problems. That's what Paul says, though. You remember perhaps that later on in his writings, he'll mention how at one point he went up to the third heaven. He had a vision of heaven. This might have been the day, I'm thinking, right here. But I also know he wrote to the Galatians this. To the Galatians, he writes to him, "I bear in my body the marks of Christ." Because the people in town stoned Paul until they were sure he was dead, and then grabbed him by one foot and drug him out and left him on the road. And all of his followers, his disciples, the people who had received the gospel, they all stood around him like, what do you think Barnabas is thinking at this point? Like, it was me and Paul and me, and we were on this thing, and now he's dead? What am I supposed to do? Keep going? And why, interesting, and I don't have an answer for you, they didn't stone Barnabas along with him, I don't know. But Paul is dead as far as everybody's concerned. And then as they're all standing around the body deciding what they're going to do with it, he stands up. He gets up.
I'm good.
It's all right. I'm good. It's just a flesh wound. He gets up and he goes back into the city. He goes back into town. Why would he do that? That's not the course I might have taken. But remember, we started out talking about valor. And Paul knows he has a task at hand. And he is not going to turn back from it no matter what the cost is. He is captive to the gospel. When they said to those people, "What are you doing? We're men just like you," they could have been saying it to you and I. Because people tend to think, oh, well, Paul and Barnabas, of course, they did that kind of stuff. That's what happens in the book of Acts. I mean, that's like normal behavior, but that's not the church today. That's not how I live my life. Paul said, we are men just like you. We are men just as you are. Then he stood and went back in. You know who lives in this town? Lois and Eunice. Lois and Eunice were one of the first disciples of Paul who lived in the town. And Lois and Eunice had been trained, they're Jewish women who had been training the son and grandson in the ways of the gospel, in the ways of the Old Testament, all these years. And now they're following Jesus. His name is Timothy. How do you suppose that impacts Timothy's understanding of the gospel? When his first hours of being a Christian, he sees what they do to Paul, and then he sees Paul's response. How does that form how he lives his life from that point forward? But they're not done yet. They go in, and then the next day, another 60-mile walk after being stoned near to death, and they make their way to Derbe. Now, at Derbe, it says they had a lot of success, but why would you keep going after all of this? Why do you keep doing the things that you're doing? It's because I'm convinced they're captive to the gospel. They're men just like you and me, but they believe in forgiveness. They're men just like you and I are, but they understand the freedom of the gospel. They're men just like you and I, but they're captive to the things of God. And he's called them to do what they're doing, and because of that, it all looks valorous to us, and to them, it looks like a disciple. So they make their way to Derbe, and then they turn around. Here's the weirder thing for me. They turn around and go back the way they came. They could have kept going east and made their way back to Antioch by land. Or they could have gone straight south and grabbed a boat and gone over there. But instead, they made their way back through every city they just came out of. And it says when they went into those cities, they appointed elders for them in every church, and with prayer and fasting and commitment to them, to the Lord, to whom they had believed, they made their way back to Antioch. This isn't how Lutherans would do it, is it? These guys have been Christians for 2 weeks, 2 months, 6 months maybe by the time they get back to Paphos. They get into town, they spend time teaching, they spend time educating some more, they spend time answering questions, and then they go with prayer and fasting and choose who's going to be the elders. I can't help but bring it up. I know I've done it several times in Acts. It just keeps coming up in the book. They believed in fasting along with their prayer. Fasting was an important part of their relationship as disciples to Jesus Christ. They fasted and prayed before they were sent, and they fasted and prayed along the way. And when they chose an elder, I'd like to remind you that in this day and time, they're stoning the Christians. And who's the first person they go for when they start stoning the Christians? It's the elder. It's the shepherd. It's the one who has stood up and said, I'll take responsibility for this group of sheep. I'll take responsibility for these people. He'll be the first one to die. And yet, these people are standing up and saying, that's for me. After praying and fasting, they appoint all their leaders, they said, and then they head home. They're not larger than life. They're men just like you and me. James will write and tell us that Elijah was a man just like us, and yet he prayed fervently and stopped the rain. They're just men, people like us that are convinced of the gospel. People like us who have heard the voice of God. People like us who have been rescued from darkness and brought into light, who knew the power of the cross and the exchange that we made at Calvary for my unrighteousness and Christ's righteousness. They knew that without him and without the gospel, they were lost and condemned sinners. And yet, they knew the power of the Holy Spirit and understood what they had and how badly others needed it. They were men just like us. And so maybe valor is too strong a word. Or maybe it's not strong enough. We'll be reminded again in supper. Be reminded again about what we have. It's the gospel. Forgiveness of sin, life, and salvation. And then we'll be sent out there. I know, it takes a long time to get through a whole chapter in the book of Acts. I shortened it as much as I could. I'd suggest maybe you go home and read through, because I skipped a bunch. There's more in chapter 14. We'll get on to see what happens to them next week in the following chapter. The church is going to have their first council meeting, and it's a little contentious. Council meeting. We'll see. In Jesus' name. Amen. The creed is a summary statement of what we believe. Some of you have it memorized. No? Yes? Okay, good.